I feel like sometimes we like trick ourselves into like, oh, I'm fine over here by myself or whatever. But like, that is not how the human brain works. That's not what we need at all.
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Shift Show. My name is Zac Erickson. And today I am very excited to join another one of the psychologists here at Shift to talk about a very relatable topic. Welcome to the show, Sam Greenwood. Sam, how are you doing?
Good, Zach. How are you?
Good. But Sam, you're a psych here at our South Edmonton location.
Yes. So I'm a provisional psychologist at the South location and currently practicing, seeing clients, doing all that fun stuff.
Cool.
Yeah,
and we are talking today about, I think, probably one of the most relatable topics, right?
Absolutely.
As far as and I think we're talking about making friends as adults.
Yes.
Right. Adult and tell me a little bit about that and just sort of like setting the stage. How do you think about having friends as an adult? Just like in general.
Yeah, it's a bit daunting. And it's something that I see a lot of clients for. I have a lot of adult clients come in and they're like, oh, I've gotten married or I've moved or I've had some kind of life change. And aside from my partner or my family, like I'm not making a lot of friends and I'm feeling lonely and it's hard to find people to relate to on that kind of level. And I'm seeing it more and more and more as an issue that people are presenting to therapy for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like one of the things that I think about often is how when like the way that we learn how to make friends growing up just naturally doesn't always translate well to like adult life, right? Like there's not like natural opportunities to make friends. Whereas like, maybe early on as a kid, you're in kindergarten or maybe even like the neighborhood kids or like your mom's friend has kids and so you're friends together or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But then you go to school and all through that it's basically just you meet people at school or through maybe some like extracurricular activities or something like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the playing field really changes when it comes to that because it's like you said, at school we have these peers, we have this cohort and oftentimes if you stay in the same city, you move through school and you're with the same people most of the time. And then you get to university and then you tend to be with most of the same people most of the time, especially if you live on campus, you get to know people in the same dorm and everything. And so being exposed to your peers in a similar circumstance like that really, really facilitates that environment for making friends, building relationships, building connections. And most of the time we're not really prepared for going into adulthood, which means maybe moving cities. It means different life transitions, having babies, careers. That makes, making friends, keeping those friendships already have a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're going to get more into this too, as well, like later on, around like limiting beliefs when we get to that. But I think there's also just this like accumulated sort of experience of at some point, somebody also, maybe I realized I'm kind of awkward or maybe, and so then there's like an additional barrier to also like make that leap and like open up to people that you don't know, right? It's a very, there's so many different things that go into it, right? And Absolutely. I think it's like you said, especially now, for those listening at home, we are recording this in late March 2021, right? With like the race of vaccine versus like third waves or whatever is going on, who knows? But right, but just that the past year has been pandemic, isolation sort of stuff going on, and that's been a huge thing for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I think that adds just a whole other dimension to this already existing problem, where now maybe we felt a little bit distance from friends before, but now in the past year, we can't see anybody. We've got this bubble. We stay at home. We can't even do like common things that we would do with friends, like sports leagues, for example.
Totally.
Like a really, really popular thing to do. Go play slow pitch outside during summer. Can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Can't get together at work. Can't do all these things. And so I think that's adding an extra element that we might be seeing for a long time, even after we start to get vaccinated, things start to go back to normal.
Totally.
Might have a lasting impression.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet all of this stuff, like, I feel like sometimes we like trick ourselves into like, oh, I'm fine over here by myself or whatever. But like, that is not how the human brain works. That's not what we need at all.
Absolutely. Social connection is so important for our well-being. And I think you nailed it. It's really, really insidious. We don't notice it at first. And at first we're like, we're fine. It's fine. Especially like getting into like living in an individual's culture or whatever. And like, you know, do everything yourself and be independent and do all this and having all those values. But over time, it's a slow realization that a lot of people have that like, oh, like I'm feeling really, really low all the time or disconnected or depressed. And it's a really slow onset. And by the time it might be particularly challenging, someone might discover like, oh, I don't even have like my friend who I can just call. I don't feel comfortable doing that anymore.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think that like there's an important connection too between friendships, which is something like I think that maybe especially like through childhood and adolescence, that's like what we refer to it as, but also as you become an adult, like it's also so much about community as well, right? And like if you think of it from like an evolutionary psychology perspective, you know, the idea of like you need to have your tribe. If you don't have a tribe, then that means you're by yourself, and that is a very, very uncomfortable situation to be in. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so this presents a really interesting problem for psychologists or in the mental health realm, because we already know that these social connections, even if they're small, they contribute to personal growth. They lead to other opportunities, other friends, career, networking. And we've also got quite a bit of research demonstrating that having a variety of rich connections with others can result in like reduced blood pressure, reduced anxiety, depression, chronic pain. Having those connections with others can be a really, really big protective factor against a lot of these things.
Like life expectancy, right? Like people who have a good community around them are actually they just tend to live longer.
Absolutely.
Which is awesome. Yeah. Well, and I think, and you dug into some of the stats. Like, tell me about that. Yeah.
So I have a couple interesting stats here. First is the pre-pandemic stats. The Angus Reid Institute actually did a study back in June 2019, so right before the pandemic hit. And they found out that 6 out of 10 Canadians would like to spend more time with friends and family. So that's 6 out of 10 people in Canada who would like to see that increased. And they also found that only 14% of Canadians would describe their social lives as very good, which is a very low number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brutal.
And then I also found, so during the pandemic, there was an Ipsos poll done in April 2020, so about a year ago now, and they found that 54% of Canadians reported feeling lonely and isolated. And of those polled, those who felt the most disconnected in Canada were the young adults, so those around age 18 to 34 years old.
Which I remember, in preparing this episode, I remember that 18 to 34 age, like later on in like the summer, you know, there was a lot of messaging coming from, you know, like health regulators or whatever, like, hey, you young people, stop like bucking the rules. And it's like, well, that's like, to me, I just make that connection. I'm like, well, clearly this is why, right? Where like so many of like, and I think that a lot of, particularly for that age range, it's like, well, they don't have, like, they're not living at home with their family necessarily. They're living on their own more, right? Like, it's much more.
Oh, for sure.
Much more connected.
This is an age group that's probably at school, probably living by themselves. You know, this is the age where you go off by yourself for the first time, typically as an adult. And so we're seeing a lot of people living on their own and over time, like a year of this stuff. Being at home alone like that.
Yeah, this one was April 2020. Right?
Yeah.
That's like, oh, you naive people, only a month into the pandemic.
Yeah, and already it's like, oh, looking bad. It's like, okay, well, here we are a year later.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I think that even going back to the pre-pandemic, right, as far as like 6 out of 10 wanting to spend more time with friends and family, just goes back to the stuff we were talking about before, right, of like job keeping people busy or even just how our neighborhoods are built. Where like I think I mentioned, I don't know if it was on the show that I mentioned this before, but like we're looking to move pretty soon here. We've lived in the same place for almost 3 years. I have no idea what my neighbor's name is. Right? I know that I've got like one neighbor on one side. His name's Mike. The other neighbor on the other side, he's got an electrician's van, and that's literally all that I know about him. Yeah. And we literally, like, our house is on the property line. I've seen him all the time, but it just was never a thing. This is something that we're going to remedy when we move, right? We're going to be those annoying neighbors who like, hey, how's it go? Right? That sort of thing. So we're going to hopefully do a little more, but.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. And I know a lot of people I know personally probably wouldn't be able to say that they know a lot of their neighbors. Like, it's pretty normal now to just like keep to yourself, be at home, and like maybe like a wave here and there. But going over with like the casserole when you move into a new neighborhood, or having all your neighbors like come around and be like, hi, I want to introduce myself, like come to this party. Not as common as I feel like it used to be. Yeah.
In fact, you'd probably be looked at as a little bit weird.
You probably would.
And I think that that's actually, maybe like a good sort of transition into like, first off, you're not alone in the fact that, people would look at that as weird, that you would even not isolate yourself. That says something in of itself that, that's okay. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway, especially when we look at those stats and consider them, is this was an issue before the pandemic. It's an issue now. It's going to be an issue in the future. And a lot of people experience it. So definitely not alone, being challenged with that connection aspect of life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and so moving into some of the, like, as far as obstacles for, or even, if we think about like people coming to therapy, talking about this kind of stuff, like what are some of the themes that you've noticed or things that at Shift, we talk a lot about like limiting beliefs and trying to understand how those impact, like that walnut emotional part of our brain kind of like kicks in and we get all anxious or worried or whatever, as we're even thinking about opening up or trying to connect with other people. What kind of stuff comes up for people? Like, what do you...
Well, the most common ones I see are, there's kind of the overarching one that we see a lot in therapy, no matter what topic we're talking about. But usually people come in and think like, well, it's me. I'm not good enough in some capacity. Maybe I'm not interesting enough. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not funny enough to make friends. And that tends to be a major one that will hold people back from stepping just a little bit outside your comfort zone and maybe introducing yourself to that neighbor or that coworker, or being like, oh, hey, I'm an adult and you're an adult and we seem to have things in common. Let's go get a beer or something. And so that might hold people back too. And if we want to get more into like the specifics, the kind of internalized belief, like I'm going to be abandoned or I'm going to be rejected, might show up as well. So specifically that might look like, oh, well, people might ultimately find out that I'm not that great and won't want to be close to me anyway. So like, why would I even put myself in that situation where I might be rejected, because that's really hurtful and that's really uncomfortable. I don't want to do that.
I think with that one, like a big, like a common one that often comes up too is like, you follow that feeling back like we do in therapy, and it's like, oh, it turns out that there's some form of like bullying or just like drama at school or whatever it is, right? Not fitting in. And then that feeling, like that emotional part of our brain's like, oh, I don't want to feel that again, right?
Absolutely.
And so now we're just anxious of like, oh, well, they're going to think I'm weird, or they're going to be mean to me or something, right? Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that could go into that.
Oh, for sure. It's that like I learned in grade 8 that I'm not cool. And so I'm going to carry that with me. And maybe not even consciously. Maybe it's just one of those things where it's like, oh, definitely like your body's doing everything you can to just prevent yourself from feeling that feeling again.
Yeah. Your body's basically like, oh no, people are dangerous. Right. And then the anxiety builds, and that's about as conscious as, and conscious isn't even the right word, right? But it's just,
for sure.
Yeah. We just get anxious about it.
And that can then bring us into maybe another like limiter that people might have internalized, that I cannot trust others. Right. So that might present as like, well, I tried to make connections with others before. I tried to make friends before and it didn't work out for whatever reason. Maybe they thought I was weird, or maybe it just fizzled out. So what's the point? Why would I even try in the future? Because that's too uncomfortable to go through again, or I don't really see the point.
Like a powerlessness to it. And, yeah, absolutely. Or like well, I'm always the one who has to call, or what do you tell people in that situation? Because I feel like that one comes up often of like, well, this feels very one-sided or whatever. Like what's your take on that?
Yeah, that does come up a lot. And it depends, because there's several ways we can go about that. It's like, okay, well, if you're always the one to call, what kind of people are you hanging out with? So in that scenario, you might have an individual who's like, well, I'm really used to being rejected. I'm really used to like, being the odd one out or excluded. And so there might be some unconscious processes there where you might be more willing to engage with people who might not be super emotionally available, because that is normal. And so that's something we would definitely explore in therapy. And that's a really great thing to go to therapy for. Alternatively, we might have biases in our thinking. So we might believe genuinely, like, it's always me reaching out. It's always me making plans. It's always me doing this stuff. But in that one circumstance where maybe your friend reaches out and says, hey, let's go to a movie, you might just like glaze over that, because that's not confirming that belief that you're always the one doing it. And we tend to not pay attention to things that happen if they don't confirm our beliefs.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I totally agree. And to add to that too, of like, I think that there's also a piece of like, oh, well, it's always me because clearly they don't care about me and I'm just annoying, and they're just like, it's just a pity friendship or something like that. Right. Where like, I'm not important kind of a thing. Whereas, I mean, honestly, like the more life goes on, the more, anytime somebody like reaches out to me, I'm always like, oh yeah, you're right. We should do stuff more often. And then it doesn't happen because life is crazy, but it's not because I don't care about those people. It's just because life is crazy. Yeah. And so I think even normalizing that too, of like, there are potential other reasons why people don't reach out to you. It's not just that they hate you or whatever. Right. Like,
yeah. Absolutely. A common metaphor I use in therapy is like, it's like the opposite of rose-colored glasses, right? Where rose-colored glasses are like, oh, I just met someone and we're dating and they're super nice and I love them and I love everything they do and everything they do is great. The opposite of that in this circumstance would be like, maybe like, I don't know, gray-colored glasses or brown-colored glasses, totally. But like seeing everything that happens as like, well, it's because I'm not interesting or I'm not likable or people don't like me or no one has time for me.
The classic of, you text somebody and they don't immediately text back and then it's like, oh no, what are like, I guess they hate me or whatever. And then like 6 hours later, they're like, oh, sorry, I was at work. My phone was in the car. The end. Right. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And the tricky part about this is this will actually present as a cycle most of the time. So if there's some kind of barrier to connecting, like those limiting beliefs we talked about, not feeling like you can trust or not feeling interesting enough, then we're not going to connect. We're going to be like, well, it's more comfortable for me to just not do that in the first place, instead of putting myself out there and risk rejection. So then someone doesn't connect and then they feel more isolated and then it strengthens that barrier, right? And then the barrier continues. And then again, we'd be maybe less inclined to go out and like go to that party or go out for drinks. And that presents less opportunities to prove those beliefs wrong because we're not doing those in the first place.
Yeah.
And so it just builds on itself.
And not only that too, but like the more alone you feel also, like if you do manage to bring yourself to do it, then the stakes are so high of like, oh, finally a person, please be my friend. Right. And there's like, it's just like, okay, like rate it in a little bit. It's okay. Right. Like have realistic expectations going in of what this is, and don't be like, and again, I say that as not like, I think it's coming from a very real, valid place of feeling, lonely or feeling disconnected. But what we would refer to as the dysfunctional need of like, I feel alone, therefore I need to be connected with somebody. It's like, well, I mean, if this isn't the right person, or if things are, situations go another way, that's okay. Right.
And then it's not devastating.
Totally.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great. And so like, what do we do with all of this? Like, I feel like we've laid out the issue pretty well. Like, how do we, especially as things are, knock on wood, like potentially getting better.
Yeah, hopefully.
Like the person in the future, like, oh, you naive 2021 March people, and how, whatever, who knows?
Yeah, just wait for the next thing. It's aliens or the stuff.
Yeah, seriously. But like, what do we do, especially like during, depending on when this comes out and when people are listening, like, what do we do now, like in the short term, maybe if there is some like pandemic stuff still going on, or even like on the way out as well?
Yeah, there's a few things. I guess the first thing, and we've already touched on this, but checking your expectations a little bit, right? So the next social event isn't this big event where everything's riding on it. So, making sure that you're like not writing all of your needs on one meetup or one beer or one party. And another thing too, with the expectations piece is, I would imagine, like I'm doing, and I'm sure you're doing too, Zach, is there's a lot of Netflix that's been watched in the last year, probably a little too much. I know too much on my end. But I've noticed that Netflix might cloud what real life relationships look like as well. You might notice Netflix has all those shows like Friends or How I Met Your Mother, or all of those other like sitcom kind of shows where it shows almost like an idyllic friend group where like everyone's super cool and everyone's super tight. And it's like this romanticized version of like what a friend group is. And I'm kind of like, okay, is this actually realistic in real life? And if we're sitting here watching all these Netflix shows, what does that mean for our expectations in terms of like real life friendships? Yeah.
Well, in a very similar way to like what media has done for like romantic relationships too, right? Where it's just like, yeah, it's like, you look like, what do they in Friends? What do they even have in common? Why do they even like each other? Like they're so different.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm sure they've been friends for a long time, and that's definitely part of it, and like shared experience. But do they do things together?
I guess they all share the beautiful, impossible apartment that you'd have in New York City, and that's like the premise.
And they're like, well, we totally scored this apartment. There's no way any of us are leaving, right? Okay, well, we might as well be friends.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're a little like weird tribe there.
Yeah.
But I think that's definitely contributing to that, and definitely to like, this is probably a trope by now and everyone's going to know this, but social media, right? We know we look on social media and see like everyone having a great time and having all these wonderful social events, and we might be inclined to think too like, oh well, my friend group don't go out and do all this stuff, and I don't have friends calling me to like do all these things. And so there might be that comparison piece in real life too, but looking at it through that social media lens, which I know is very familiar to everyone by now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that like the things that are the most important as far as like, or I guess as far as, I know one of the things that's really important as far as connection goes as well is the physical proximity piece, right? Like actually being in person, which right now is not great, right? Like that's, and I'll speak for myself where like if I don't know how many people are still excited about doing like a Zoom meetup thing, right? Where it's like, okay, let's all sit together and be lonely together
and watch the same movie separately and like talk about it.
Yeah. But like, what are some of the stuff that's like, as far as like, what about like for yourself? Like what have things been like over the past year?
Oh, well, probably pretty similar to everyone else. I mean, it's important, I guess, to mention too that therapists, as like knowledgeable as we might seem about social connections and psychology and well-being, definitely same for therapists too, right? Absolutely. I know my small network of therapists in Edmonton, we all struggle with that kind of stuff. And
we're used to like for a job, like coming in and like meeting one-on-one with people all day long.
Oh,
and
for
then all of a sudden it's like, hey, go and sit in front of a computer for 8 hours and
Yeah, absolutely. And in that way, I kind of see it as a gift because I'm like, cool, part of my job is getting to talk to people and like connecting on that level. But yeah, it's definitely difficult. And even just talking with my partner about it, who has spent most of the year at home as like the house husband, even getting his perspective of like, wow, it's like really, really hard just to be home all day, every day and like not go outside and talk to a human being. And so, it's definitely difficult for everyone. I guess the big thing is normalizing it. And typically when I see clients in therapy, I do my best to normalize that piece too and be like, look, it is hard. This is what we can do now, but this is a pretty universal thing. Yeah. That even existed before the pandemic, but that the pandemic made worse for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like a lot of people too may have like, I know for me, there have been kind of like two different groups of people. And even for myself, I feel like there are the friends that really stuck through, right? And you like stay connected with, and you feels like this has been like, oh, I'm glad that you're in my life. And other ones, and maybe even other, depending on how I've sort of ride the line between introvert and extrovert. But I know like for some, they're like, oh, like I haven't missed that at all. That's interesting, right? Like to sort of like evaluate, not that you want to evaluate like the value of people, but more of like, how are these like friendships, I didn't realize maybe how much pressure this particular person in my life was putting, or I was maybe, I was just feeling because of in certain relationships or whatever. And so I think part of this as well has been sort of like taking time to be like, oh, well, what are the valuable relationships in my life? What does that look like?
And even what do I want in a relationship?
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
I think this time has been a reflection for a lot of different things because we haven't been as distracted as we usually are with like work or day to day. We're forced to kind of sit at home and reflect a lot. And it's like, wow, what do I even want out of my connections? What's okay? What's not okay? What was I putting up with that? Like, I'm actually kind of relieved I'm not having to talk to this person every day. Or on the flip side, I also know of some people who have been like, oh, I don't actually need to talk to this person as much. And we still are pretty good friends. Like, wow, we haven't talked for 6 months and we can like pick it right back up and it's been fine. And learning like, just because you're not hearing from someone, you're not going to be abandoned either. Yeah. And so I've seen two sides of the coin there. The one being like, okay, well, here's some relationships that kind of stuck through and show me the value. But then also that like, okay, but even if I'm not going to hear from this person every day, I'm going to be okay anyway.
Yeah, right. Totally. Yeah. And I feel like for some of us as well, there's this feeling of like that this is going to change things. I don't know if that, like, I know for myself as well, like, again, for you and I, our social skills are still like top notch because we're doing it every day still. Right. Probably not. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, sure. They are for sure.
They're great. Yeah. Totally not awkward. But I do think that there's a certain level of like, I think about some people that I haven't seen in almost a year that I'm like, oh, that is going to be, like I've got a friend who like brought over some bread a couple of weeks ago, just, neighborly thing. And I was like, thanks for coming by. I don't even really remember what to say to people when they come
like,
over.
Hey, exactly. Yeah,
don't come in. It's illegal still, right? Like,
but thanks for this food that you made me.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is definitely that narrative of like, oh, when things are better, like everything's going to go back to normal, and maybe it will. But I think there might also be some long-lasting effects of what this last year's been like, far outlasting vaccines, right? And I think a lot of people are leaning on that, like, oh, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. Like anytime now, things are going to be totally fine and everything's going to be fine. And it might be worth just considering the fact that, like, sure, things will be fine, but they might be different and they might permanently be different. And that might look different for how we socialize with each other. I would imagine that online interactions are probably going to be a bit bigger and they might stick around more than they might have like a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Even like in the workplace, just as a side thing too, right? Like there are some things that, like even at Shift, we've got like some like group stuff that was going on. And I made a comment of like, yeah, but I want to do this in person. And they're like, it's never happening. Like that's too much of a, there's too many people first off, but then there's almost this, because the online stuff has been normalized enough that now it's like, just the momentum of what it's going to be for a lot of people, right? Of like, that's just now just what people want to do instead.
Yeah.
And I tend to disagree for a lot, right? I think that there is, because of the like physical proximity, that you want to have that in place as much as possible. But I do think, to your point, I think there's like there needs to be like an openness to like, yeah, but what are we going to do right now? Right. And I was like, well, why have we waited? Like, do you feel like there are people like you're like waiting of like, oh, we'll just wait this out.
Wait for the perfect time where it's optimal to start up again.
Totally. Whereas, and I think that it was particularly challenging when it was like minus 30 degrees or whatever, and they're like, only outdoor gatherings. I'm like, wow, thanks guys. Like, we'll go find.
Great.
It's like, but we'll go build. No, we can't build an igloo and have fun because then it's an indoor thing again. Okay, well, how do we even do this? Right? Like.
Yeah, for sure. And that totally goes back to the expectation piece too, right? Yeah. Where it's like, okay, maybe meeting up with people is going to look a little bit different than you thought. Maybe it's not going to be just like going to the bar and making your BFF, right?
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed, and I think it's going to stick around a lot, my partner, when he kind of spent his year in solitude, he's getting a job now, so he's going to be okay. But his year in solitude over COVID, he's a big like Dungeons and Dragons dungeon master guy. And he just like made an online group and did it. And he's been doing it for months. And he's like, I think the online D&D thing, which D&D is like enjoyed a renewed popularity.
Yeah.
He's like, I think that online piece is going to stay.
Oh, that's going to stay forever.
Right.
Yeah. I play on the weekends as well. Like every couple of weeks. And, our group is split right now of like half of us are like, hey, as soon as we can do it in person, we're going to do that. Right. And the other ones are like, I don't know. I kind of like it.
It's kind of convenient.
What? No, like, but yeah, it's, I do think that having more options, I think, is definitely a good thing. And I think to your point too, of like, maybe it's okay if we don't have such lofty goals. Like, and I think that there's a difference between like settling, right? Which is, I think, we don't want to like settle necessarily for less than we need. But I do think, to your point too, that like not everything has to be this idealistic, like wonderful thing. Some friendships, I had a client actually when I was, this was quite a while ago, but we had a lot of conversations about like different tiers of friendships. Right? That like you've got like your like A class, like ideal, like we're best friends kind of thing. And then there's like a B tier and then a C tier. It's like, oh, we're more of like acquaintances, or like, and like it's okay to have a bunch of acquaintances, or it's like okay to have people who you just do certain things with, and that's all.
Yeah. Enjoy a variety of different relationships. And I've seen similar things to that too. I've had people come to therapy and be like, well, I want that friend group where they can just like come into my house and we can hang out all the time and we're really tight and all this stuff. And it's eventually found out that like, oh yeah, I actually moved to Alberta from abroad like a month ago, but I want all these things. And it's like, okay, well, these things do take time. And that's a very idyllic kind of community that this person's wanting. But I'm not sure that, I don't think a lot of people do actually have that, like, again, Netflix picture perfect friends kind of group of friends, right? And it's like, that's great to want that. But if you're, if not getting that specific kind of super close knit group of BFFs thing, if you're not getting that and that's making you really, really unhappy, well, it might be time to like take a step back and be like, okay, what are my expectations like here? And, how can I still form those connections without?
Well, and am I relying on other people for like fulfillment? Right? Like there is a need for like social connection, obviously, but if it's, if you're expecting that that's going to be, like a full-time thing, right? Like that might be something that is a much more long-term aspirational thing that you work towards. And it's like, okay, well then if that's what you want, well, you're probably going to have to be the person who arranges the meetups, right?
Yep.
You have to be willing to be that person because you can't expect other people to do it for you. You've got to be, open to, inviting people over, and then the people who are really good and want to have a relationship like that, cool. They'll probably come back, right? If it's a positive thing, and it's gonna be a lot of trial and error, right?
Absolutely. And getting okay with the idea that like, you might be rejected by some people. Some people might be like, no, thank you. I'm not looking for friends. And being okay with like that that small, like little rejection.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
One thing I learned, I'm a little more on the introverted side, but I have a lot of like super extroverted friends who just like make friends with everybody, and seamlessly. It's a beautiful skill to watch. But like, even watching them do their thing and like be really, really good at making all these connections, they'll have people once in a while who just like don't work out as friends and don't work out as connections, and they can just brush that off and keep going. And they've got like a wicked social life that I'm sure a lot of people would be really envious of. But getting there meant, a lot of those roadblocks and those barriers along the way that can be really scary, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think too that it's like, there's this need to like not just be friends for the sake of being friends. Like, what does it take to even have a friendship? Well, like, what do you base that on? Right? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, one thing I often say is I think that connections are often a side effect of the main thing that you're actually doing, right? So oftentimes, and I've heard this feedback quite a bit from people in my personal life or in therapy, but they're like, oh, well, I tried the meetup group and I tried the like making friends group in university, or I tried this, and yeah, maybe I like talked to a couple people, but it fizzled out. There's even Bumble BFF. Like, it's like the dating app where you can make friends instead of the romantic part. And that's another one where I've heard a lot of like expectations didn't get filled out there, because they're like, well, I went on Bumble BFF and yeah, like I talked to a couple people, but like nothing really solid. And I think that that's because if you try to make connections for connection's sake, that often doesn't work, or it doesn't really produce the results we want. Often, if you think about like the best friends you've ever made and the greatest connections that you ever made, usually that's from doing something else. Like, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, well, I met like my best friend during my like Psych 101 class in university, or they were my neighbor in my dorm room, or like they were my roommate. Like, a lot of my close friends were like people I was roommates with, and just they were randoms off the street, and we wound up living together and being in really close proximity and doing a lot of the same things. And that's how that connection grew.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it, and maybe where we're getting a little bit sidetracked in that, like, going out just making connections for connection's sake might not produce what you're looking for.
When the only common ground, that Bumble BFF thing is, I'm curious how successful that is, because there is a little bit of like, like, hopefully they've got some sort of like matchmaking thing similar to what exists, maybe, right?
Maybe.
Right. But like I feel like if the only thing that you have in common is that neither of you have any friends, is that much to like build a healthy friendship on? I don't.
Yeah. And what are we swiping on in that circumstance? Like, are we swiping on the same things we're swiping on for like finding a partner? Or
Nope, ugly friends.
Yeah, no ugly friends.
It's like, okay, well, this is it's interesting, right? And I don't know enough about it to like dismiss it, but I think that there's I think you're right. I think that a lot of the friends, even like in high school that I was really good friends with, they were usually the people I was in, like, I would do like stage stuff, like show choir, or like musicals and stuff that I would do with. And like some of the people that I did that with were like some of the best friends that I had, right? Because of the common interests and things like that. So I think being engaged in something that you enjoy is, I think, an important piece. And then you will meet other people who are also, interested in that kind of stuff as well. And you'll common or I guess similar personalities or whatever as well. So
a lot of the shared interest stuff, a lot of the shared activity stuff, which kind of leads us like circling back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this episode, where we're like, well, how do you do that as an adult, right? Because like, obviously, like school, you're with people all the time in a very similar life stage, so that's easy. But usually for adult clients, I would say start small with that kind of stuff. Like, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to look for the thing that I can do with other people, and then maybe form my connections a little more organically that way. I found that even starting as small as like an online Facebook group, I know as lame as that sounds, can actually produce pretty good results for people. I have personal experience with this. When I first moved back to Edmonton not too long ago during a pandemic where I didn't know anybody, I actually joined a book club on Facebook. And that was like last year, like nearly a year ago now. And I like still talk to this group and we meet up every month and getting to know each other a little bit over Zoom. And it's been really, really good. And I'm like, okay, I never like even expected to like have like friends from this. I just wanted something to do because I was bored. And now like I'm developing connections slowly over a pandemic just from a Facebook group.
Totally. Well, and it's interesting. I wonder how often we miss opportunities to make meaningful connections with people because of the thing that you just said of like, oh, well, that's kind of lame. Right. I remember, so I spent a little bit of time like volunteering in the Philippines in my early 20s. And I distinctly remember one of the funnest, like it was just like a get together of something in like a community hall. The craziest game of musical chairs I've ever played in my life. Right. And I was like, why does nobody ever play musical chairs? This is crazy. Right. But it was like, just if you imagine just like a bunch of like adults playing musical chairs, it was the craziest thing I've ever seen. Right. But I feel like, and not to say that that's what you should do, but if there's this feeling of like, oh, well, that's lame or that's weird or whatever, don't close yourself off to opportunities. If this is something like, you know what, whatever, like if this is going to be helpful, great. Like if you try it and then you end up later being like, oh, okay, well, that didn't really turn out. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, what did you lose?
Yeah.
Right. Like that's
exactly.
Okay. But we're so worried about going, to what we said before about like being cool or like fitting in. There is a certain degree of just be yourself. Right. And just lean into having fun and, just being present, I think. So.
Absolutely. And that's one of the empowering things about getting older and leaving university and getting into your late 20s, 30s, 40s is you can ease into who you are a little bit better. And usually it's a time that people do that. And this could be an opportunity where you can be like, what do I actually like? Like maybe before I was like going to the bar and drinking with my friends, which is super fun, but not a lot of opportunities to do that now. What else do I like? What else do I want to do? What else would I enjoy?
Yeah. And
starting there, right? And then at the very least, you find something that you enjoy. Maybe you don't make like your next great BFF, but spend some time doing something kind of fun.
Yeah.
Right.
And even if it's just like, oh, you know what? I met a really interesting person or whatever, right? And it's just like you meet somebody new or you reconnect with somebody who you haven't seen in a while. And it's just like, man, like, that was nice to catch up with that person, right? And it's like, you don't have to be best friends, right? But it's just, just good connections that when you see them and it's positive and and going from there. Absolutely.
It's taking those connections at face value, right? Just enjoying the conversation or the hangout time just for what it is with nothing attached. No, like, well, are they ticking all these boxes or are they going to be like, my best friend or all of this, just enjoying it for what it is and seeking out more, even if it's the person next to you in line at Starbucks whenever Starbucks reopens up, just having that conversation and connecting with someone in the community that you'll never see again.
Totally. Well, and I think as well, like, and what we're saying with all of this too is not necessarily like, hey, you should put up with people's bullshit, right? As far as like, you're allowed to have boundaries.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think hopefully that's clear, but just more that like, I think that I often kind of come back to, the research around like what makes a meaningful romantic relationship, right? And a lot of it is like, you've got to be, you've got to accept your partner for who they are, right? And there's a lot of like, giving them the benefit of the doubt and being kind to them and giving and listening and trying to understand and I can't think of a single person who I am good friends with that I haven't had some sort, like we've probably both at some point being like, hey, don't be an idiot. Like you don't, whatever is going on, like there is going to be moments of conflict, but that's okay. You don't have to bail out either. Right. Yeah. You meet people where they're at for sure. So
definitely. I think an important thing about having close relationships and something that you can work on in therapy. Not that I'm plugging therapy, but I totally am. I think everyone should do it. Yeah. But just that acceptance that like being in a close relationship means that you probably will be let down at some point and you might let someone else down too. Yeah. And that's okay. And learning to like overcome those barriers and take a look at them and be like, okay, well, communicate about that. Or, what can I do next time? Or are my expectations too high? And just being able to maneuver those conflicts and get to know them a little bit rather than like try to avoid them at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah. It is definitely like a a vulnerable position to be in, but if you're willing to be vulnerable and to open up, that's huge, right? Like that can really, a lot of times in my experience too, there's like some conflict that happens, but in resolving it, you actually become better friends afterwards. It's like, we just we leveled up there, right? Like,
yeah.
Right? Like it feels like we actually are even closer friends now because you get me in a way that you've seen some of my badness and still like me after, right? So.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And if you look back at the research, vulnerability is a huge component of close, genuine relationships. And I think Brene Brown has her whole career basically built on vulnerability, right? And how important of an ingredient it is when getting to know someone on that level where you're satisfied in that connection and you're seen and you feel seen. But vulnerability can be really difficult. And that often, going back to those barriers, that often presents a barrier too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, as far as other barriers, right? Like obviously time is a big one. But what are some of the ways to kind of be aware of these things? Like what are things we need to be aware of? And also how do we kind of push through them and not let them get in the way?
Well, I think the first part of college is just being aware of these barriers when they come up and be aware of how you feel about them, right? Oftentimes, if you're feeling frustrated or feeling lonely or feeling like you can't engage in a certain thing, just take a step out of it. Just take a step out and be like, why am I feeling this way? Am I feeling this way because I'm not feeling good enough or adequate, or I'm uncomfortable with vulnerability, and explore that a little bit and get to know that. But it could also just be that intolerance of things not going in that prescribed way that we want them, right? So, that time example, for instance, maybe just taking that time to accept that connections take time and work.
Yeah.
And they do. And that's okay. Or sometimes people have a lack of time for connections, and that's okay. And just getting to know that discomfort around it a little bit. And when we get to know that discomfort, we set a bit of a distance between that, and we can get to know ourselves a little bit more. Otherwise, a lot of just kind of things I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but even just if there's one realm of your life or a specific connection that you're not super happy with or that you're not getting, going back to that piece of what do I enjoy doing? Do I want to start a group? If you can't find a group, consider starting one, right? Really, really easy to do. A benefit to the last year, I think, is a lot of little activities have become way more accessible because I think people have been bored and wanted to fill the gap. So, D&D, again, like I said, has been a really big one, but there's other things like knitting, baking, book clubs, reading. A lot more people are engaging in these more quote unquote simplistic activities.
Yeah.
But it's gotten to a point where they're big, the knitting communities I've seen are insane.
Yeah.
And I have a cousin who's becoming the knitting queen of Edmonton, and she's forming little connections with other knitters.
Yeah.
And there you go. There's a network of people right there.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that having that I think it's great of just well, what do you want to do? Right? Start somewhere. That's okay. You don't have to, and just get back into it. And I think that sometimes it's just oh, well, this muscle has atrophied. My social muscle has atrophied. And it's okay, well, that's okay. That's fine. Just I think meeting other people where they're at, I think is important, but meeting yourself where you're at too. And just being kind to yourself through it and being okay, well, let's just do a little bit more. Let's reconnect. Let's do whatever. Even if it's just, what's going to push you just to that next step. That's all you got to worry about.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's definitely a muscle you flex. And a lot of us haven't flexed the social muscle in a year.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are in the same boat. And that's an important thing to remember too, is we're all kind of getting with that. And so if you step outside your comfort zone, it'll be okay. And I think people will be more understanding than you realize.
Totally. All right. Well, is there anything else that you, as we kind of wrap up, that we want to make sure to cover, or?
I think we pretty much covered it. I guess the take home, on my end is I really want people to take home that statistically most people are struggling with social connectivity right now. Right. And that this is very normal, and I want to normalize that. And there's nothing wrong with you if that's something you're struggling with right now. And like you said, Zach, just taking it small, taking those little opportunities as they come and doing that self-reflection and taking a look at, that discomfort piece and getting to know it a little bit. And if you're like, wow, this discomfort is like really, really big, or I just can't break through this, like this limiter that I have being vulnerable or trusting others, then yeah, maybe it might be time to reach out, talk to someone or talk to a friend about it or a family member or someone you can trust. Get to know that discomfort a little bit, because when you get to know it, it's easier to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, like I think that therapy is always a helpful thing, as well as like kind of breaking that stuff down, or just whatever is helpful in those other relationships in your life, or even just journaling through some of that can be helpful too. But
yeah, absolutely. And for my little thing, getting out and starting to socialize anew, I guess my fallback is always like, I just point out how awkward I've gotten in the last year. And usually that makes people laugh and that facilitates things a little bit. That's the relatable part, right?
Yeah, totally. Awesome. All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's been fun. Hopefully everybody out there found this helpful, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear, so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by Shift Psych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.